6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. Today we are joined by author, historian and great friend, Dr. Erica Canela. How you doing, Erica?
Hello. I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. And how are you?
No, I'm good. I'm really excited to get stuck into this episode because it's been a long time coming, and it is to celebrate the launch of your brand new book, Zealous, A Darker Side of the Early Quakers. It sounds like an awesome book, but what inspired you to write this book?
What inspired me to write it was as I was working on my PhD, the subject matter naturally gave me these characters, and it was just kind of like, you know what, this is a story that needs a wider audience. This is a history that needs a wider audience. A lot of times, certainly, throughout, Quakers have written Quakers have been meticulous note takers throughout history. And when they're writing their history, it's tended to be written by Quakers for Quakers. And then certainly in the last 75 years or so, it's become quite an academic subject. But it's also sort of remained within the ivory towers of academia, you know what I mean? Where it's just kind of, it's very academic history. And there's been historically quite a lot of emphasis, as you would expect, on theology. And so as I was doing this research, it's like, this is a fantastic social history. And it is that social history of those, the people who essentially have kind of been forgotten by history. And that was the idea of sort of bringing this story to people who wouldn't normally consider looking at Quaker history. It was too good of an opportunity. And so I feel really fortunate to sort of be able to sort of give this, this is my contribution to the world in a way.
Well, having read your book, it was really interesting seeing a different story, as you were saying, because we have this misconception about Quakers being plain, boring, and they're anything but. Before we dive into the Quakers, what Quakerism is, I think we need a contextual understanding of what the religious landscape of England was like at this point, because you mentioned so many different denominations. You mentioned the Quakers, the Puritans, the Laudians, the Catholics, you even have the Protestants. So it all seems quite confusing. So could you just let us know what the context is like?
Yeah, of course. So Quakerism really starts in the early 1650s, in the aftermath of the Civil Wars. And during that period, certainly in the 1640s, during the Civil Wars, there is just this, it's like an explosion of ideas, of radical ideas. People are really taking advantage of the fact that there isn't a whole lot of censorship going on because people are quite preoccupied with, war. and so these ideas, again, sort of coming from continental Europe, others homegrown, are very much, they're spreading at quite a rapid pace. And the reason that they are spreading is because they are essentially the ideas are traveling with the army. And in most cases, the radical, as you would expect, the radical religious ideas are traveling with the parliamentary armies. So they are just, it was very much a bit of a free-for-all in terms of religious ideas. Of course, the state church is like, whoa, what's happening here? But it very much was like a bit of a Pandora's box where, once they sort of took the lid off of that, once people had access to the printing press in the way that they did in the 1640s and 1650s for sure, there just was no going back. These ideas, they just caught on. And, some were very short-lived, very, very short-lived. Some lasted a fair bit of time, like fifth monarchists, even ranters to an extent, The ideas lasted a little while, but Quakerism has stood the test of time. And a lot of people, if you were to ask people sort of, where did Quakers come from? Say oatmeal, right? Like you would say, like you would think it has something, first of all, a lot of people think that it started in the colonies. They don't necessarily associate it with taking place or really starting in the north of England, but that is where, that was the epicenter of the very early Quakers, is in the north. And the reason why it really took hold in this time period, certainly during the Civil Wars, towards the end of the Civil Wars, is, like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of censorship happening. People weren't overly concerned with sort of these radical ideas.
With the printing press and the parliamentarians' army just going across and spreading ideas, what differentiates Quakerism from these other viewpoints? What do they believe in? Because some people might look at it and go, well, they're all Christians. Why is there such an issue with these different beliefs?
So sort of like the core beliefs of Quakerism, when you're looking at it with 21st century eyes and minds, it doesn't seem very radical at all. Obviously at the time it was, but it is, it's very progressive, right? So they believe that there's no need for the clergy. First of all, of course, that's going to sort of set some alarm bells. Like, whoa, wait a second. My entire livelihood depends on this. This obviously comes into play later on. So they don't believe that you need the clergy, that you can have this personal, direct relationship with God. I mean, this is a pretty radical idea. They also don't believe in, you don't need these ostentatious churches. Like you can worship at any time, any place. And so for the established church, this is like, hang on a second. I'm not sure I'm vibing with this.
And then, so you've got the established church going, well, I don't like this idea. This is affecting our central control, and this is affecting, the way that we make our livelihood. What are the everyday people saying? Because we tend to get drawn into discussions, particularly around this period, of what the establishment, the government, and the monarchy are thinking. We very rarely look at what everyday people are thinking and saying.
So another sort of very appealing ideal that sort of comes with Quakerism is this belief that everyone is equal. And again, the clergy are no better than you or I. And so again, this is kind of setting some alarm bells off. And so with my study, this is very much about the people on the ground. There's not a whole lot of filtering down, right? It's like it is that perspective of the everyday person. And so this idea that people can communicate directly with God, it's quite appealing. It is, it's like this sounds all right. But the other thing is that when you think about the time period that we're coming out of, it's the civil wars have just ended. The king has been executed. We have this kind of experimental government happening. Nobody knows what's going on. And for a lot of people, this very much felt like the end times are coming, because we have seen a lot. People do throughout time. People turn to religion when they're afraid. And I do think that the reason, one of many reasons that the Quakers were successful, is because they were coming up with they basically were spreading these ideas at an absolutely perfect time. There's a captive audience. There is an engaged audience. They're looking for an alternative. They're looking for an alternative and better future. Be that being raptured and going to the right place, or having a better life on Earth. So I do think that it's, that message resonated. There's the message, right? And as I'm very passionate about, it's also the way that the message is delivered. This causes a lot of problems for them at the onset. It's like, Quakers were cool until they weren't. No. Quakers were not cool at the onset. Like the local authorities were like, whoa, Nellie, what is coming? What is this? Who are these northern people coming down into our communities and spreading chaos? Because there was also, and certainly in the south of England, there is that like, oh, these are strange people. These are strange people from the north, which I find wild. But there's, the way the message is being delivered is quite controversial because they are not just sort of very meekfully, peacefully coming into town saying, oh, would you like to listen to this idea I have? No. They are storming into the churches, interrupting services. They are interrupting these services and telling the ministers, the vicars, preachers, like, you are hireling priest, you devil dog. And the congregations are like, whoa, what? Why are you coming into my house of worship saying these things? And the congregations, they respond exactly how you think that they would respond, right? They're not thrilled, and they resort to violence to get these people out. And so you do have cases of Quakers, certainly in the early mid 1650s, are going into these churches and they're essentially being hauled out, beaten with sticks on the way out. And, some of them are reporting some of them are, in their Quaker records are reporting these injuries. And I couldn't believe it. They can't believe that people are not receptive to the message. And it's like, oh, you're reading these meeting minutes and you're reading their accounts and you're reading sort of the pamphlets that they're writing. And you're just kind of like, how are you all not getting this? This is not the way to reach some of these people. But, they found an audience. They found an engaged audience of people who are like, yes, you are absolutely spot on. Forget these hireling priests. I am tired of paying tithes to this lot. And I will follow you because we're not going to pay tithes. And, we can worship God wherever. This seems like the right religion. This seems like the path. And when the world comes to an end, because it kind of seems soon, because things are a bit weird, I'm going to go to the right place.
I mean, I can completely understand someone standing there and going, well, you've been beaten up with sticks at the last 3 churches you've been to. I don't think you should be doing this anymore. Like, it does seem like a bit of a message. But then when you're talking about that audience who go, actually, yes, this is something I agree with. I don't want to pay tithes. Whereabouts in society are these people from? Are they rich landowners? Are they labourers, from the bottom of the social order? Where are they coming from?
So this is an excellent question, and one that historians have kind of been tackling for forever, really, because what social strata did these people come from? And certainly with the research that I have found that the Quakers were very much coming from what would be called the middling sort. They aren't in extreme poverty, but they aren't sort of the elites either. However, what Quakers do is that they somehow manage, as they're proselytizing and spreading the word throughout the country, is that they are finding they're making key connections with well-connected people. And some of these people are judges who can, keep them out of jail. Others are very sort of more well-to-do tradesmen who have enough money to be able to sort of take on the risk of holding Quaker meetings in their home. Because if the local authorities come and find them, they can handle it. There are certainly cases where, the local authorities, when people were, basically being hauled out of meetings, arrested, fined, they would be the dead of winter and the authorities would be taking coats off of these people saying, yeah, I'll have that. They would be, there are cases, again, these are Quaker accounts where, there would be a very old sick person, and the authorities would come and take all the bedding away, again, in the dead of winter. And so there were ways to sort of, to hit the less fortunate in well, I guess in quite...
It's quite a nasty way, really.
It is. It's deeply, it's deeply personal. Like it almost feels petty. Like, do you really need that man's coat? But they would take it anyway. But the Quakers would also sort of, within these grassroots communities, like I said, there would be people who had the means to handle the fines. But most importantly, certainly as we're going through the second half of the 17th century, is that these fairly well-off members of these local Quaker meetings, they are leaving land, building materials in their wills, so that way, when they die, a Quaker meeting house can be built. And so that's obviously a very important part of that Quaker journey, is having a place, again, it's not a church, but it's a meeting house where they can all worship together.
Now, that does show the differing levels of people, of different social and financial levels of people joining Quakerism, and I think it's quite illuminating, really, to see that these people can financially support the building of the organisation. But then you also have preachers who are travelling the country, who, it's not like travelling the country and selling snake oil. There's no way of building profit and making money as you're going around the country. So how do these preachers make a living when they're on the road, or how do they pay for an inn, sustaining that effort to spread the word?
So that is very, very much almost at the onset. Quakers were very organized. And so immediately they set up a fund. It's called the Kendall Fund, based, as you can probably guess, Kendall. And so basically they have funding to be able to support missionaries. Because like you say, they're not snake oil salesmen. They're not making money on the road. I mean, in a lot of cases, they're going on the road and fully aware that they are probably going to be imprisoned several times. And so with the Kendall Fund, which is obviously, with the administrative center of Quakerism, which, like I said, started very, very early, they have money to give to, for things like shoes, for things like, food. So I guess the things that you would expect. Quakers are also relying, when they're traveling, they're relying on sort of hospitable locals to take them in. They are relying on sort of maybe some, someone in a lovely, friendly, independent congregation to let them in, so that way they have some place to stay. And so like I say, there is a lot of organization taking place. It's surprising, actually, but it's also it's paramount to their survival, and why, we have, an iconic oatmeal mascot today. It's because of this very early Quaker organization. It's Quaker organization, and it's also the way that they are able to take control of their narrative.
And that organisation is and that control of narrative is certainly one of the reasons why they're still here, because that organisation allows them to sustain themselves at the beginning when it is so difficult. But one preacher that you talk about who is incredibly fascinating is George Fox. So could you tell us about him and how his story highlights some of the darker parts of Quaker history?
Yeah, so George Fox, he is, for all intents and purposes, he is the leader of Quakerism. There is some debate amongst historians where, they don't necessarily want to give him all the credit. I can see where they're coming from, but I think it's quite difficult to sort of say that really anybody else is the leader of the Quaker, founder of the Quakers, really. So I'll go back. I'm going to take you on a little journey. George Fox, he is born in 1624 in Fenny Drayton, and he is the son of a weaver. And it seems like his upbringing is relatively comfortable because during the Civil Wars, he is essentially taking a gap year, and he is traveling amongst the parliamentary army, like sort of, safe places, I guess, and sort of very much finding himself at home with the Baptists. He's finding his way. All of the Quaker ministers, most of the Quaker ministers that I've come across, when they're excellent biographers, they write these spiritual autobiographies, and they're always, when they write about themselves, they write about how they were so lost until they found Quakerism. And so essentially George Fox is on a spiritual walkabout, trying to figure out what makes sense to him. He's obviously, George Fox is seeing all these messages, all these religious beliefs sort of coming in. And so he's, like I said, he's on a gap year during the Civil Wars, traveling around, trying to find his spiritual home. And then suddenly he has this epiphany that this is it. This is it. What George Fox doesn't say, right, is that he's kind of gone and cherry-picked from the religious ideas of the day. A lot of these ideas coming from the Civil War period. It's just kind of like picking a little bit out of A, out of B, out of C, and so. But he ends up sort of, putting it into a package that is very. It works. It's acceptable. So then he takes this idea and he essentially starts talking to independent and seeker communities in the North. And this is where it really takes off. And so he finds really key converts at the onset. So Margaret Fell, who is known, I don't think anyone disputes this, she is known as the mother of Quakerism. She is the one, her family home, Swarthmore Hall, becomes in the very early days as the administrative center of the early Quaker movement. So she's an early convert, and again, one of these really, really key converts. Not only because she's got this big house in Ulverston, but she's married to a judge. And now her husband, Judge Thomas Fell, he doesn't convert to Quakerism, but, he helps them sort of navigate their way. And so she's a critical early convert. So is James Naylor. So James Naylor is another, when we're talking about sort of who founded Quakerism, James Naylor comes up a lot because he was very important in this period. He is he fought in the New Model Army. He is older than George Fox. That's actually another thing, is that a lot of the Quakers that I've researched, it's a relatively youthful gang, which I found quite surprising. These are people who, these are men in their 20s and early 30s. Is it cheesy to say? They're zealous? They are zealous, right? They're zealous. And very few are more zealous than James Naylor. James Naylor, like I said, New Model Army. He was in the New Model Army, but he's also he's a gifted preacher, incredibly charismatic. This becomes very problematic later on because there almost becomes like a little cult around him. And then things really get ugly in 1656 in Bristol. But anyway, he's a key convert. Same with another early friend who dies very young and dies early in the movement is Richard Farnworth. Richard Farnworth is a prolific writer. Again, a young person who can write like nobody's business. And he is inspiring people. They are very likely to have read something that James Naylor, George Fox, or Richard Farnworth had read before the Quakers are coming into town. They are prolific writers, and they have access to the printing press. again, thanks to that lack of censorship, which is carried on post-Civil Wars, you do have radical printers who are willing to take the associated risks with printing and disseminating this stuff.
I think it's really interesting just how powerful the media is at this point in the 1640s onwards, because it shows a lot of parallels today as well with the rise of a new media. But there was a really interesting thread there that I wanted to pull on. And you mentioned the role of women within early Quakerism. And there seems to be a paradox between what Quakerism is saying about women, but then how Quakers are treating women. So could you dive into that a little bit more? Because I thought it was incredibly interesting seeing these two ideas fight.
It is. So there's this idea of equality, right? And so, we're, at the onset, we're thinking like, clergy and sort of lay people, everyone's equal. Well, Quakers sort of take it a next step further. Again, this is very radical for the time, and that women can preach. And this is going to make some waves. It's like, whoa, girl, you need to get back in the kitchen. And so, obviously there are these ideas, but there's also, there's pushback from Quakers as well. And there's also this kind of question. Now, granted, in the early period, which is what I look at, right? I'm looking at the very, very start of the Quaker movement. There are some women who are absolutely, like, I don't want to say girl power, but I'm going to say it. Like, they are exhibiting like some true girl power aesthetics, and sort of, they have this freedom to preach, and they are preaching. However, behind the scenes, there's also kind of a little bit of like, how public do we want these women to be? And, women would find themselves in more pastoral roles, right? So they would be visiting Quakers in prison. They would be mending clothing. They would be kind of just doing those kind of expected roles, but again, they want, like, there's this idea of equality, but actually getting it was, for a lot of women was quite difficult. Even just setting up, women's meetings, there was pushback from the men. Like, why do they need this? And then certainly with the research in the region that I sort of look at, which is Herefordshire and Worcestershire for the most part, the things that the women are doing in their meetings, a lot of it is sort of, looking at marriages, again, sort of looking at, it's about relationships and keeping a happy home. And so yeah, no, you bring up an excellent point where the outer message is very big and bold, but behind the scenes, it's kind of like, ooh, what do we do with this? And so, as with everything, there are some anomalies, but certainly sort of with the research that in my research, like, I have found that, sometimes women are they were in some cases minimized. And then the one particularly big female woman-driven story is a woman who essentially seems like she's lost the plot, and so it's not great. It's not great PR for ladies.
And it does seem very, very difficult for some of these women to try and reconcile the fact that they've joined something that's preaching equality, but then, in practice, it seems quite difficult for them to attain it. But then within there's also that idea of, going a wayward kind of way of practicing Quakerism. So what is Quaker leadership doing about those people who aren't necessarily following the party line, following the religious line, just not following what they're supposed to be doing? Because you get that in every sect, and sometimes it's like go to confession, 10 Hail Marys, but what are Quakers doing about it?
So that's an excellent question. So Quakers go hard into discipline very early on. And so they become, certainly once they've kind of gotten like the very extreme radicalism out of their system, like sort of as we're sort of going into the late 1650s, certainly 1660s onwards, they become very aware of the reputation that they have, and that the only way they can survive is if they get their people in check. And so this is where the meetings come in. And so you'll have these monthly meetings, and every they pop up throughout. I mean, there'd be at least one monthly meeting in every county. And so in these monthly meetings, sort of, there would be rumors of what some of the Quakers are doing in town. And so it would be up to the people who are at this meeting to straighten them out. So you would have things like, oh, I hear that John Smith is spending extravagantly. I'd like to we're going to send James. I'm so bad at making up names. The Quaker names that I have, can I have a side note here? Quaker names. The Quaker names that I have, because they're first generation, are very, very boring. There are a lot of Jameses, Johns, Walters, Humphreys, things like this. It's nothing jazzy. It's nothing special. Whereas as time goes, generations, Quaker names become kind of legendary. And, they start naming they basically start naming their children after the virtues they want them to inhabit. So this is where we get sort of the Quaker names like patience and love and chastity, things like that. So my friend and colleague, Dr. Isabella Rosner, has sort of had it was a very, very viral social media post about Quaker names that she had discovered in her research. And I was totally envious because my Quaker names are so incredibly boring. I cannot get over how boring they are in comparison. We were both doing our PhDs at the same time. And so she would say, look at this name I found. And I would just be like, I've got another John, like another James. And that's really about it. There is nothing interesting about the Quaker names of the first generation of Quakers. That was a diatribe. I'm so sorry, Jackson. Anyway, John Smith is spending extravagantly. His local meeting catches wind of it, and they will send 2 members to go and talk to him. There'll be another, you'll go through the meeting minutes and they'll be like, this person has actually been accused of abusing his wife and children. In no culture is this okay. And again, Quakers will send members to go and talk to them and sort this out. Discipline is very important because they're aware of their reputation in the outside world, and they need to coexist. I think that once it kind of became clear that the world wasn't going to end, it was like, we got to rethink our strategy here. And so it very much became about preservation. And part of that preservation is about, it's about preservation. It's about maintaining a positive image. It's going into, it's constantly being aware of PR issues, essentially. And early Quakers are very quick to try and stop this stuff. And if people, if a Quaker was, essentially beating his wife, and if he wouldn't stop, then they would be threatened with, I'm sorry, we're gonna disown you. You're out of here. Like you're not part of our gang. And so it's discipline that they start. Not only do they start sort of policing people in person, but certainly in the 1660s onwards, they start censoring almost what's being printed. So gone are the days of saying that people are going to be thrown into a lake of fire. Quakers need to they're again taking control of that narrative. And in 1674, they set up this, essentially what's an editorial board called the Second Day Meeting. And so this meeting is basically anyone who's printing something they need to send a draft to this meeting, and then it's approved, goes to print, or actually we're going to need you to take all of this out. Go ahead and redact that. So all along they are controlling that image.
And I think that's incredibly forward thinking from the Quaker organization to ensure that kind of reputation, fantastic masters of PR, is preserved. But does that go hand in hand with, later on after the Civil War, them being, after the Civil War and the Commonwealth? You can tell this is not my area at all.
It's all right. I'm here to educate and inspire. I'm people who don't necessarily think about the 17th century. I want them to come over from either side and yes, this century is amazing. There's so much happening. It is so exciting. Come over.
It needs to have its moment. That's what we've been speaking about that a lot this year. But then is this going hand in hand with them seeing the Quakers as a threat to their power, to their organizations, that PR management style?
Yes, I mean you can certainly see a progression. Certainly when Charles II comes and reclaims the throne, things change quite quickly. Charles II is very tolerant at the onset of these groups. And then Quakers, again, you give them an inch and they'll take 5,000 miles. And in the 1660s, there is a lot of legislation going that's impacting Quakers. And Quakers are spending a lot of time in prison because they're breaking the law. They're breaking the law. Now, Quakers say they are persecuted, but they are breaking the law, so I think that they are probably just prosecuted. It's one of those things where it's like
it's a thin line.
It is a very thin line. And so basically Charles II, he comes back, woo, fanfare, blah blah blah. Everyone falls into line, forgets the last 10 years happened, forgets the last 20 years happened. Like, oh yeah, love this. And then we have obviously a few months later, we have Thomas Venner and his Fifth Monarchist Revolt, which, is essentially, I think it was a real wake-up call for Charles II. And that is like, oh, right, these groups can be kind of dangerous. And so Quakers immediately are just like, whoa, that had nothing to do with us. And this is when, so in 1661, they have it's known as the Quaker Peace Testimony. And so George Fox essentially gets this to Charles II's hands. And it's basically a document that says, we will never raise weapons against the king, the monarchy. And so it's, again, just kind of like saying, look, that was them, not us. We're cool. Okay, good. And so this is where the narrative of Quakers always being peaceful comes into play. Because if you look at if you look at the long span of Quaker history, it really was very early on that they're declaring this. But this is my sort of, I guess, issue with Quaker history and the way that it has been, the way that the excellent PR that has lasted for centuries is that just because someone is not brandishing a weapon, that doesn't mean that they're peaceful. Because sort of going into a church and disrupting and essentially just chastising the minister mid-sermon, that is not peaceful. Going into towns and telling people that they're all going to go to hell, that isn't peaceful. Reenacting Christ's entry into Jerusalem and essentially blaspheming, like that is not peaceful. Trying to raise someone from the dead, it's not peaceful. And so that's where sort of like, that's kind of my soapbox of history, is that the early Quakers were not peaceful. No, they didn't take up weapons against anyone, but they're also incredibly disruptive. And as they're, in 21st century speak, they would, they're covered in ASBOs, right? They're so antisocial. They're so antisocial. However, like I said, 1661, they sort of are taking immediate steps to distance themselves from like actual sort of physical violence. And it's a shrewd move. It is a shrewd move. However, I mean, they do continue with their meetings. They do, continue violating the law by having these unauthorized meetings. And so it's kind of like they're doing these big gestures, but kind of still sort of carrying on their path. You know what I mean? I mean, you can kind of see right through them, right?
I mean, it's bizarre that their history seems to be riddled with these little paradoxes. We're trying to be like saying they're being peaceful, but in practice not really being. Saying they want equality, but in practice not really giving it. And it's very fascinating to see that arise in a group of people who we traditionally think as being plain, boring, and as on the front of Quaker oats. But I think now, Erica, that's a nice point to ask you our final fun question, as we do for every guest who comes on the podcast.
Okay.
Now, you are a big fan of American sports. If anyone can tell, Erica's American. But which?
Yes, I can't really hide it. I cannot hide my Americanness at all.
But which is your favourite sports team, and why?
Okay. I was not expecting this. I was not expecting this at all. Now, this is a tough question for me because growing up, my dad was a huge LA Lakers fan. Like sort of like the Showtime Lakers were his team. And I spent many an hour watching basketball with my dad. And I was just absolutely I loved it. I thought Magic Johnson was everything. James Worthy was my dad's favorite player, so that was my favorite player. I was like, he's cool. He wears goggles, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. However, over time, I've also sort of developed like quite a fondness for the 1990 Chicago Bulls. And it's just like not only sort of, Michael Jordan. I mean, did you watch the Last Dance documentary?
Of course, it's amazing.
I mean, everyone who is cool has watched that. I found it absolutely. It's just it is such a fine documentary. But what I really love about that is that you forget what a friggin' outstanding player Dennis Rodman was. He was incredible, an absolute force to be reckoned with. But I think that obviously his public persona has really overshadowed what a powerhouse player he was. So I've got sort of the LA Lakers. I've also got the 90s Chicago Bulls. But then like sort of at the center of my world is the 1992 men's Olympic NBA dream team that went to Barcelona. And my favorite book of all time, will we consider it a history book? You're damn right we will. It is Dream Team by Jack McCallum about the 1992 men's basketball team. And so Jack McCallum is a Sports Illustrated Hall of Fame journalist who traveled with the team in the run-up to the Olympics and then also was there with them in Barcelona. And it's written from the point of view of a true sports fan, but you feel like you're there. And it really does an amazing job of humanizing these players who were just at the time. I mean, we've got Michael Jordan, we've got Larry Bird. Granted, he's on the cusp of retirement and barely able to move. Magic Johnson, after he announces to the world that he's HIV positive, like that's a story in itself. But then there are all these players that come together in this perfect moment of NBA history. And I love that book. And I love classic NBA. Do you have favorite basketball, or do you like basketball?
Oh, I love all sports. I think that first of all, I think they're three great answers. Because
I'm so glad you approve.
Lakers, you can't not like the Lakers, and I think that Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls team with Dennis Rodman is just, and Scottie Pippen is just incredible. I like the Toronto Raptors. I spent a lot of time in Toronto just after their NBA championship. Watch them play as well. I think they're fantastic. But I'm more of an NFL fan, NFL and NHL fan.
So who is your NFL team?
The Jets. So I have had many a year of absolute misery, crappy quarterbacks, and just not very good football. But I like them.
I won't lie. Like, obviously the NFL has been gaining an audience in the UK over the years, and certainly since in the last 19 years that I've been here. But I have to say, I have never met a single person in this country with that answer. So you are not jumping on a bandwagon. Like, you have chosen a team that is perpetually losing.
Yeah, my brother chose the Giants. We were over there in 07, 08. So my brother chose the Giants, and he got a Super Bowl first year against Tom Brady, and I got the Jets. So he definitely got a better deal than me. But Erica, we've only spoken about a tiny aspect of Zealous, a darker side of the early Quakers. Where can people get a copy?
Well, you can order them. You can order this book wherever awesome books are sold online. I have not only in the UK, it's on pre-order in the US and continental Europe. It is definitely for sale. I've checked Denmark. I have checked Germany. I have friends in these places, so I've checked for them. But so in the UK, the book is out on the 30th of September. In the US, it's going to be around the 30th of November. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward to sort of seeing this. I mean, this piece of work has been on my brain for the last 13 years. So it's quite a moment to sort of let it fly, essentially. But we're sticking with the crow reference. Let it fly out into the world. And yeah, I hope that people like the book. I hope that people read it, and I hope that it's an engaging enough read that people want to know more. They want to sort of read wider into the 17th century. They want to read wider into the Civil Wars, Oliver Cromwell, look at sort of, the more academic work the more academic Quaker history scholarship out there. I'm hoping that it's a book that's kind of essentially serving as a gateway for this period and for Quaker history. That's my hope anyway.
Well, the 17th century, I think, is certainly having a revival at the moment. So I'll make sure there's a link for your book in the description below, so people go away and get a copy and take part in that 17th century moment. And then, obviously, people want to go away and interact with you and your work. So where can they go?
So they can go. I am on Instagram mostly. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on X. You can find me on Blue Sky. My name is Erica Canela. Usually my handle is at Erica Canela. I have one of these weird names where they just merge into one name. And so it's Erica Canela. And literally, if there's a social media, I'm there. So I look forward to preaching about mid-17th century Quaker history.
Well, I'll make sure they're all in the description as well, so people can go and interact with you. But thank you very much for coming on, Erica.
Thank you, Jackson.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.